What if the freedom to walk across your village's fields, graze your animals on shared meadows, or gather firewoods in the woods simply vanished, fenced off, locked and sold? For centuries, the English countryside was a patchwork of open fields and commons where land was farmed collectively, rights were shared, and rural life followed rhythms that were as much communal as they were individual. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, that world disappeared behind hedges and fences. This is the story of enclosure, how Parliament passed law after law to privatise land, forcing millions into a new way of life. Some saw it as progress, efficient farming, modern capitalism, more food. Others saw it as theft, dislocation and loss of community. So how did the enclosing fields reshape Britain? Not just its landscape, but its very idea of ownership. And why does it still matter today? To understand what enclosure meant, we need to picture the world before it. Imagine walking with Agnes, our composite character, a cottager in Northamptonshire in the early 1700s. Agnes's family holds a small strip of land in the open fields, scattered among her neighbours' strips. She grazes her cow on the common meadow, collects firewood from the woodland, and turns her geese loose on the stubble after harvest. This wasn't free-for-all chaos. It was governed by custom and local rules. Villagers decided together when to plant, when to harvest, and when animals could graze. It was messy, inefficient perhaps, but it endured survival and shared responsibility. So why did landowners begin to view this communal system as a problem? And what did they stand to gain by tearing it apart? By the 18th century, wealthy landowners began pressing for a radical reordering of the countryside. Agricultural improvers argued that the open field system wasted land and discouraged innovation. Private ownership and consolidating holdings, they claimed, would boost productivity and feed a growing population. For Agnes, these debates were not abstract. She heard the talk in church and at the market. Landlords petitioning Parliament for enclosure acts. Each act redo the map of a parish, extinguishing common rights and dividing land into individual plots, often favouring the wealthy. By 1750, enclosure was no longer just a local decision. It was driven by law, and with every act, the fence posts crept further across England. But if enclosure promised efficiency and progress, why did it provoke such bitterness and resistance? Enclosure created clear winners. Landowners consolidated farms, raised rents and profited from more intensive agriculture. Larger fields meant new techniques, crop rotation, selective breeding and higher yields. Britain's agricultural revolution was underway. But for villagers like Agnes, the story was different. She lost grazing rights and could no longer afford the fees demanded for enclosed land. Her cow, once essential to her family's survival, had nowhere to graze. Without access to fuel from the commons, winter grew colder. Many families like hers were pushed off the land altogether, forced into waged labour or into towns and cities. This wasn't just about farming, it was about power. Landowners gained control, while the poor lost independence. So how did people resist? And could ordinary village folk ever fight back against Parliament and the landlords? Resistance to enclosure was fierce. In the Midlands, villagers pulled down fences and hedges at night, an act of defiance known as hedge breaking. Pamphlets denounced enclosure as robbery. Preachers thundered from pulpits about injustice. Agnes's neighbours whispered about uprising. The Midland Revolt of 1607, when thousands had torn down enclosures and clashed with troops. Later, during the swing riots of the 1830s, labourers smashed threshing machines and set fire to hayricks, symbols of a world being mechanised and privatised. But the odds were stacked against them. Enclosure was backed by Acts of Parliament, by courts and by soldiers if necessary. Resistance slowed enclosure, but it could not stop it. If enclosure was inevitable, what did it mean for Britain's future, especially as new industrial towns began to rise? As families, like Agnes's, lost lands and livelihoods, many moved to towns in search of work. The timing was no accident. Enclosure fed directly into industrialisation. The dispossessed rural poor became the labour force of factories, mines and mills. The countryside was remade, but so was Britain's class structure. Land ownership concentrated in fewer hands, while a swelling working class found itself dependent on wages. Enclosure didn't just change farming, it changed society. Here's a question for you. Do you see enclosure as necessary progress or as a theft of the people's lands? Drop your thoughts in the comment. I'd love to know what you think of it. But beyond debates about winners and losers, enclosure left another mark that endures to this day. What happened to the landscape itself? Look out of the window on a train journey through rural England and you'll see enclosure. The patchwork of hedgerows, straight lines of fields and fenced off pastures are the physical legacy of the 18th and 19th century acts. For Agnes, these hedges weren't quaint or picturesque. They were barriers that excluded her and her family from land they'd once used freely. But for landowners, they were symbols of order, control and profit. The countryside we romanticise today, tidy fields, hedge-lined lanes, is a product of conflict and exclusion. So if enclosure defined the countryside, how did it reshape the very idea of property and ownership in Britain? Enclosure was more than an agricultural change. It was a legal and cultural one too. It redefined land as a commodity that could be owned absolutely, bought and sold without regard for communal rights. This was a seed of modern capitalism, where private property, not shared rights, was the foundation of wealth. It's why today, when we speak of my land or my property, we think in terms set centuries ago by enclosure. But while Britain fenced off its fields, it was also fencing in its politics. What did enclosure mean for democracy, for class, and for the rights of ordinary people? The enclosure of the Commons was one of the most dramatic transformations in British history. It redrew the countryside, dispossessed millions, and paved the way for both industrial capitalism and modern notions of property. For landowners, it was a triumph. For the poor, it was a trauma. When we talk today about access to land, housing crises, or even debates about who gets to enjoy the countryside, we're still grappling with the legacy of enclosure. Fencers built capitalism, but they also built inequality. Thank you for walking a little further down the road that made Britain with me. The story winds on. Try this one. I think you'll like it. Until then, thanks so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you very soon.